Hi, I'm Bill Vennard, and welcome to Equip 412. If you recall from the last episode, we examined the question, why did God become a man? Within the scope of that study, I also probed another question, why was a Redeemer even necessary at all? And the answer was, the character of God demanded it, the problem of sin required it, and the restoration of a relationship between God and humankind longed for it. You see, for God and man to be restored to the relationship that he originally intended, redemption needed to occur. In ancient Israel, God provided a temporary way for sin to be covered and atonement made. The blood of perfect, unblemished animals had to be shed for the sins of the people. But that became a burden on individuals. How, you ask? Well, those sacrifices had to be repeated year after year, and they had to be done in the temple, which was located in Jerusalem, which meant most people had to travel, sometimes great distances, 3 times a year to celebrate the required feasts. But there was hope. It was the prophet Isaiah who first provided the hope that the day would come when the burden would be lifted. In Isaiah 53, God declared that the suffering servant, that is, the Messiah, would be the sacrifice for sin. In verses 10 and 11, the prophet writes, "But it was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied, and because of his experience, my righteous servants will make it possible for many to be counted righteous, for he will bear all their sins." There are some who refute the whole concept that Jesus even died at all. So in this episode, I'm going to spend some time addressing the question, did Jesus really die? There's no doubt in the mind of any reasonable person that Jesus was crucified and died. There's just too much historical evidence, not only in the Bible, but also in the writings of historians of the time, such as Josephus, a Jewish historian, Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian, Lucian of Samosata, a Syrian writer, Mara bar Serapion, and even the Jewish Babylonian Talmud. These secular sources from the 1st and 2nd centuries after Jesus' death, plus the Jewish Babylonian Talmud, certainly would not fabricate a story of Jesus' death if its writers could have proven otherwise. The Quran was probably the first to make the claim that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but instead fainted or was given a drug to make it appear that he was dead, and was later revived in the coolness of the tomb. Others who don't want to believe in God have also made this claim. So let's look more closely at what's called the swoon theory. The swoon theory goes like this. Jesus was not really dead when he was placed in the tomb. Once he was placed in the cool tomb, he somehow revived, escaped, and convinced his disciples that he had risen from the dead. There are numerous fatal flaws with this theory that I want to examine. There are at least 6 flaws to the swoon theory given by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I'll add one of my own later for a total of 7. First, both enemies and friends alike believed Jesus was dead. The Romans, who were professional executioners, whipped and beat Jesus brutally to the point of collapse. Then they drove heavy wrought iron nails through his wrists and feet and plunged a spear into his side. They didn't break his legs to speed death because they knew he was already dead. Also, Pilate checked to make sure Jesus was dead, and Jesus' death was the reason his disciples went into hiding and had lost hope. Those brutal Roman techniques have even been verified through archaeology and non-Christian sources. Second, Jesus was embalmed with 75 pounds of spices and wrapped in bandages and a shroud. Now, would Joseph of Arimathea have embalmed Jesus and wrapped him up if he was still breathing? Not likely. And third, even if everyone was wrong about Jesus being dead when he was placed in the tomb, how would a severely injured and bleeding man still be alive a minimum of 36 hours later? He would have bled to death. Now, before I go on to look at the rest of the fatal flaws, I want to talk about some of the medical evidence surrounding his death. The Gospels tell us that when Jesus was praying in Gethsemane, that he began to sweat blood. This is a real medical condition known as hematidrosis. It's not very common, but it is associated with a high degree of psychological stress. According to Dr. Alexander Metherell, as quoted by Josh McDowell in his book, The Case for Christ, what happens is that severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into these glands, and the sweat comes out tinged with blood. We're not talking about a lot of blood. It's just a very, very small amount. But what this also did, according to Dr. Metherell, was set up the skin to be extremely fragile so that when Jesus was flogged by the Roman soldier the next day, his skin would be very, very sensitive. Now, Roman floggings were horrible and very brutal. They usually consisted of 39 lashes, but it was often more. It just depended on the mood of the soldier doing the flogging. The whip that was used was called a flagrum. It was made up of braided leather thongs with jagged metal balls woven into them, like you see here. The balls would cause deep contusions, which would break open with severe blows. And the flagrum also had pieces of sharp bone, which dug into the flesh and ripped as the flagrum was pulled back, causing deep cuts and gashes. The back would become so shredded that part of the spine was sometimes exposed by the deep gashes. The whipping would have gone all the way from the shoulders down to the back, the buttocks, and the back of the legs, causing unimaginable pain. Metherell continues, one physician who has studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. A 3rd century historian by the name of Eusebius described flogging like this. The sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. Many people actually died from the beating before they were even able to be crucified. The victim would experience tremendous pain and go into hypovolemic shock. Hypo means low, volume or vol refers to volume, and emic refers to blood. So hypovolemic shock has to do with a person suffering the effects of losing a large amount of blood. Dr. Metherell explains this does 4 things. First, the heart races to try to pump blood that isn't there. Second, the blood pressure drops, causing fainting or collapse. Third, the kidneys stop producing urine to maintain the volume that is left. And fourth, the person becomes very thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace the lost blood volume. What happened during the actual crucifixion? First, Jesus would have been laid down, hands in the outstretched position to the horizontal beam known as the patibulum. Next, 5 to 7 inch long wrought iron spikes were driven through the wrists. Now this was a solid position that would lock the hand. If the nails had been driven through the palms, his weight would have caused the skin to tear and he would have fallen off the cross. Now, in the language of the day, the wrists were considered as part of the hands. Metherell describes the pain this way. Picture taking a pair of pliers and squeezing and crushing the nerve. That effect would be similar to what Jesus experienced. The pain was absolutely unbearable. In fact, he continued, it was literally beyond words to describe. They had to invent a new word to describe it. Excruciating, which means out of the cross. At this point, Jesus was hoisted up as the crossbeam was attached to the vertical stake, and then the nails were driven through his feet. His arms would have immediately been stretched, probably about 6 inches in length, as both shoulders became dislocated. This fulfilled Old Testament prophecy in Psalm 22. My life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength has dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust and left me for dead. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. Back to the fatal flaws swoon theory. Number one we saw was both enemies and friends alike believed Jesus was dead. Jesus was embalmed with 75 pounds of spices and wrapped in bandages and a shroud. Number three, even if everyone was wrong about Jesus being dead when he was placed in the tomb, how would a severely injured man survive a minimum of 36 hours? And now we come to number four. Even if he did survive the cold, damp, dark tomb, how could he unwrap himself, move a 2-ton rock up and away from the inside of the tomb, and get by the elite guards who would have been killed for allowing the breach of security? With the damage to the nerves in his feet, how could he have walked from the tomb, through Jerusalem to where the disciples were, and then convince his disciples he had been resurrected, all in his horrible physical condition? Given all that, how could they have possibly seen him as being worthy of worship? And given the primitive state of medical treatment in first century Israel, how could his wounds so severe have ever healed? To my knowledge, no one ever survived Roman flogging and crucifixion. Number five, the swoon theory cannot explain Jesus' bright light appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus. What turned this hater of Christians around not long after the crucifixion? It certainly wasn't a normal human being who had been healed of all his horrendous wounds from his crucifixion experience. Paul was blinded after his encounter with the bright light for 3 days and experienced a 180-degree attitude change. He went from Christianity's most fervent enemy to its most ardent advocate. His conversion experience cannot be explained by a swooned Jesus wielding a torch. This was a dramatic display of divine power in broad daylight that dramatically changed a man and the world forever. Number six, we have already seen this basically, but non-Christian writers affirm that Jesus had died by crucifixion. The Jewish Talmud actually says that Jesus was hung on a tree on the eve of Passover. Now, this is a source that is certainly not considered friendly to Christianity, so there's no reason to doubt its authenticity. There's one more fatal flaw to the swoon theory that I want to add, and that is the complexity of details that would be needed to not only pull off such a conspiracy but also maintain that conspiracy would have been virtually impossible. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say that Jesus somehow survived his wounds and was still in the tomb when women showed up after the Sabbath to finish preparing his body, only to discover he was still alive. How did they move the stone from the entrance without the guards noticing? Since Jesus would have been in no condition to move a 2-ton stone himself, even a strong, completely healthy man would have had a great deal of difficulty doing that. Or maybe, just maybe, they asked the guards to help them. Then, after all that, how did they get Jesus past those same guards? And if that isn't enough, where would they have taken him without anyone seeing them? Okay. Even if they had been successful doing everything I just mentioned, they would have had to come up with an incredible story to create the myth of a resurrection and start a movement based on that myth. Finally, knowing that the whole thing was a lie, why would the disciples willingly endure incredible hardship, suffering, persecution, and even death? Such a theory is simply beyond reason, and no reasonable person could ever believe that. So let's review the medical evidence. Hematidrosis caused by severe psychological stress, hypovolemic shock due to suffering of a large amount of blood. Then there's the horror of crucifixion, spikes through the hands and feet, dislocated shoulders, extreme difficulty breathing, which would eventually lead to asphyxiation. Not to mention that before Jesus was allowed to be removed from the cross, a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear to verify his death, resulting in the flow of blood and what appeared to be water. Now, prior to death, the sustained rapid heartbeat caused by hypovolemic shock causes fluid to gather in the sac around the heart and around the lungs. This gathering of fluid in the membrane around the heart is called pericardial effusion, and the fluid gathering around the lungs is called pleural effusion. This explains why, after Jesus died and his side was pierced, blood and water came from his side, just as John recorded in his gospel. According to medical experts, there's no way Jesus could have survived all this. He was, without any doubt, dead when they removed him from the cross. What does all this mean? It means Jesus willingly gave himself over to his executioners. Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Jesus didn't resist his arrest. He was dragged before religious and government leaders for a phony and illegal trial and refused to defend himself. Why? In the words of Dr. Metherell, Jesus knew what was coming, and he was willing to go through it because this was the only way he could redeem us, by serving as our substitute and paying the death penalty that we deserve because of our rebellion against God. That was his whole mission in coming to earth. Again, I ask, why? And I suppose the answer can be summed up in one word, and that word would be love. Thank you for watching this episode of Equip 412. Did Jesus really die? I think we can say pretty soundly, conclusively, that yes, he did. Please go to equip412.com and check out all of the previous episodes. That will provide a context for each following episode. Also, would you please do me a favor? If you like these vlog posts, please click share and subscribe. And by doing that, you would be helping me get the word out to as many people as possible. Until next time, remember, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Friends, may the Lord bless you, and I pray I will see you again soon.